Well, good morning and welcome to another episode of Just Jesus. Today, I want to take a look at a story that Mark records for us in chapter 3 of his gospel, where he says, Jesus entered the synagogue and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. So Jesus is in the synagogue on the Sabbath day. There's a man there with a withered hand, and he calls the man over, and he looks at the Pharisees, and he says to the Pharisees, "Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath day, to save a life or to kill?" And they wouldn't say anything. And Mark tells us that Jesus is grieved at their hardness of heart. So he says to the man with the withered hand, "Stretch out your hand," and he did. His hand was restored, and that made the Pharisees mad. It ticked them off. So they left, got together with the Herodians, and tried to figure out a way to destroy Jesus. Two things about this story that I want to remind us of this morning. First of all, the motives of the Pharisees. So they see Jesus again in the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and God had given them one of the 10 Commandments to remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy, and the Pharisees had developed this whole set of rules about what you could and could not do on the Sabbath day in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. And so they're looking at Jesus. They see the man with the withered hand. They see Jesus, and they wonder whether or not Jesus is going to heal this man. And they're watching this not because they feel sorry for the individual with the withered hand, and not because they're hoping that Jesus will in fact heal this man, was that Jesus would do something so that they could get him into trouble. So their motive was poor. And sometimes we might be tempted to listen to what people say, not because we're interested in the truth, not because we're really all that interested in what they have to say, unless we can use what they say to get them in trouble. And again, you see it quite often. The news, stories on the internet, somebody might say something and people will take their words and they will twist them and basically accuse them of saying something that they didn't say or meaning something that they didn't mean. And that's what the Pharisees were doing here. But notice that after Jesus asked them that question, they didn't say anything. And Jesus looks at the Pharisees, and Mark says he looks at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart. Jesus is upset with them, and he was moved to grieve because they wouldn't even begin to consider whether or not their interpretation of the Sabbath law might be incorrect. They wouldn't even stop to consider that there might be a different interpretation of God's meaning of remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy than the ones that they had come up with. And that's what grieved Jesus. Their heart was so set. It's described as being hard, what we would typically call set in stone. They were not going to entertain, even for a minute, the possibility that these set of rules and regulations that they had developed around the Sabbath day might not be what God really intended and what God really meant by his command to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And that's what made Jesus sad. That's what made him grieve. And I think it ought to give you and I pause today that sometimes we think we have the truth and we know what it means, and nobody is going to suggest even the possibility that what we think might be incorrect, or that there's another way to look at a passage of Scripture, and our heart is set in stone. And we need to be careful about that. I remember one of the things that Peter wrote was that he said some of what Paul wrote was hard to understand. Some things are hard to understand, and some of us may not understand at all. And some of us may understand it differently. And in cases, that could be perfectly fine. We just need to be careful and make sure that our heart is soft and that we're willing to look at different perspectives as we try to figure out how to live our lives in a good relationship with God. Well, I hope you'll have a great day.